All right, thanks everyone for coming. I know it's 9 a.m., it's early. Hopefully you're not too jet lagged if you came from the US like I did. I'm Colin Hottman. This is estimating Armington elasticities with scanner data. First, this is joint work with Surabhi Ghai, who's a former RA of mine at the board, who's now a fourth-year PhD student at Columbia University. And then I just want to note a couple of disclaimers. First, these are our views, not the views of the Federal Reserve Board or system, and not the views of Information Resources Incorporated. Okay, so just our views. So with that, let's talk about Armington elasticities. Why do we care? What are they? So, Armington elasticity is a parameter which governs the degree of substitution between products produced in different countries. And this is a fundamental parameter in international trade, international macro, hopefully near and dear to our hearts in this session. And, just for some very simple high-level reasons why this parameter matters, right? This parameter governs the magnitude of the relative demand response, international relative price changes. It matters for the international transmission of business cycles in IRBC models. So it's a key parameter we care about in a lot of different kinds of models, right? So Armington elasticity is an important one for understanding business cycles, understanding exchange rate pass-through effects to quantities, all those kinds of things that I think we care about from a policy and a theoretical perspective. So Armington elasticity is a key question, but there's a very big, well-known debate in the literature about the magnitude of such elasticities. And this is kind of, I think, the crux of the problem from a policymaker's perspective. And from just a forecasting and sort of theoretical perspective. And so I think this is a well-known thing, but I'm just going to summarize this just for purposes of getting us on the same page. Armington elasticities are typically much larger in trade models, say when we estimate them, or typically when we calibrate them, than they are in business cycle models, where they're often calibrated. And there's a number of competing explanations for this divergence. So Armington elasticities are bigger in trade models than in macro models, for example, because of this idea in Finster-Russ et al. That the elasticity across countries, which they're going to define as the microelasticity, which is the one in trade models typically, might just be fundamentally higher than the macroelasticity, which is the one between domestic and foreign products, which is really the parameter we're thinking about in an IRBC model. So first explanation, these are just two different objects, really. And the trade one is a model where they're basically more substitutable because there's more varieties that are closer in some kind of product space. On the other hand, perhaps that's not the explanation we prefer. So there's a paper by Ims and Majan argues, really this is an empirical question about aggregation bias. So basically, the aggregate estimates from the business cycle literature could be subject to an aggregation bias, and that's why you're getting a smaller elasticity in those kinds of models to the extent that they're trying to estimate it. And so Ims and Majan try to deal with that empirically and make some arguments and show some estimates of that. And then alternatively, a number of other explanations could exist. So they could be different time horizons we're thinking about in these kinds of models, right? So there could be a short-run elasticity in the sort of business cycle macro literature, and the trade elasticity could be a longer-run elasticity. And those could be different objects. So if we think about elasticities perhaps increasing over time, products become increasingly more substitutable, this could explain the gap between the trade literature estimated at higher frequencies and the macro literature, which is typically much more like quarter-to-quarter type business cycle frequency. Finally, it could also be the shocks in business cycle models, which is fundamentally different from the shocks in trade models, and they're just identifying different moments, and they're just different parameters in that sense. Yeah.
So what would that parameter be? Like some average elasticity, and they will take their biases somewhere with respect to the average. What does that single parameter do? Do you think that the truth is that there is not one, but that there are many?
No, I think you're absolutely right. So a heterogeneity explanation is a little bit like the Finster paper, but I mean, that's the simplest case of just two cases, right? Obviously, in general, there could be much more. And I think that's also related to the Ims and Majan view, that there's a sort of bias as you aggregate up. And so the Ims and Majan argument basically is that we might have thought the aggregate elasticity is some weighted average of the underlying, right? And then the reason you don't get that appropriate is because of the aggregation bias. So that's basically their argument that, in principle, we might think of it as exactly that the macro one should be a weighted average. But if you just estimate on macro data directly, you're not going to get that object correctly. That's their argument. So let me just sum up. There's a bunch of identification issues in the literature here. We're thinking about problems with endogeneity, measurement bias, and generally low statistical power. So this is a debate I think that's been hard to resolve. We're going to try to get at this, and I'm going to be most closely related to the first paper here. So I'm just going to acknowledge there's a bunch of other views in the literature here, but I'm mostly going to take on the view in the first paper most seriously. And what we're going to do is basically ask the question, does the macro elasticity of substitution, which is the one between domestic products and foreign products, differ from a microelasticity of substitution, which is the one between specific varieties of domestic products or specific varieties of foreign products. And we're going to think about this in the US context, where I've got data. And in particular, I'm going to bring novel data to this question. So relative to the Feenstra-Russ et al. Paper I mentioned, which is using aggregate trade data in the US, I'm going to be using scanner data. Okay, so this is barcode level retail scanner data. I'm looking at 14 narrow product categories. You should think about things like beer, carbonated beverages, coffee. These are the kinds of products defined in my data. So this is not the universe of products. I have to acknowledge off the bat, this is not the universe of US imports, not the universe of goods. It's a specific set of products in the consumer packaged goods sector where we've got very detailed data. And particularly, my data is going to run from 2001 to 2012. So I've got relatively long time period here. Now, importantly, I think this is unique to the US case. We're the first paper I'm aware of to have country of origin information at the barcode level in the US context. So I'm going to have a barcode. I'm going to know basically whether that barcode was packaged abroad and then the country for which it originated when it was packaged abroad. So made in China, made in Mexico, made in Canada is the kind of thing you should keep in mind. There's going to be a bunch of products which say made in the USA, and then there's going to be a remainder which say nothing. Generically, I'm going to interpret those as US products, but you should be aware that this is basically not a statement about value added. I know basically the last place of transformation, and that's really all I know. But nonetheless, I know products which came from a foreign origin, and those are going to be well identified by that country of origin, and that's unique in the US case.
This might not be a big deal in the case of like retail products, but for example, the iPhone, it says made in China, but like produced by Apple in California. Like, what if there's something like that?
No, absolutely. There's going to be lots of things for which I can't say that the value added, is necessarily, there's no foreign component, right? What I know is that the last place of transformation occurred in the US or abroad. If it occurs abroad, I know the country from which it came from. So in US law, all products packaged abroad, destined for US consumers, have to say made in country X. Okay, but if they have foreign value added that are incorporated into the US product through domestic production, I don't know that source, right? So there's going to be an underestimate in some sense of the share of foreign content here, but I'm going to at least identify for particular products, if they came from abroad, in the last country of origin. That's really all I can say.
But like in the case of the iPhone, I would assign the iPhone to China, but like we would all view the iPhone as an American product, right? So that's what I was trying to get at.
Yeah, I think what matters here in this context is really, do we think these products are closer in some kind of characteristic space? So products that are packaged abroad, are they similar to each other than they are to US products? And that is an open question, right? But that's kind of the sense in which I'm thinking about this. So it's not even necessarily that I think consumers intrinsically care about country of origin. Rather, it's a proxy for their position in characteristic space because I lack any really other characteristics observable.
I get that completely, but I would say that in that intrinsic product space, the iPhone would be more similar to something produced in the US than to other stuff produced in China. But
yeah, I mean, just to follow up just slightly on that, I would say the iPhone's closer to what Samsung's producing. They're probably both foreign products in some sense, but yeah, we can have that discussion. Okay, so then what I'm going to do, just finally, just to give a clean interpretation to my elasticities. To be very clear, I'm going to be estimating elasticities of substitution across products available on the shelf in the same retail store, okay? So this is not necessarily the exact object we're going to get in the macro literature, but it is a very specific and clean comparison where I know that I'm conditioning on a product set in the same store, so these products are directly comparable elasticities in that sense. So that's kind of the object I'm estimating. But from a methodological perspective, we are making a contribution here as well, and I think that's the other thing I want to highlight. So what I'm going to be doing specifically is developing a novel generalization of the Feenstra 1994 identification procedure for a nested demand system, okay? So Feenstra, Russ, and al. do have a generalization for nested demand system. Ours is different. I think ours is better in a couple ways, but most importantly, I'm going to show you it identifies the full set of parameters for the whole nested system in a single set of transparent moment conditions simultaneously, which is different from their estimation. And in particular, the second point here is I can show that our set of moment conditions can accommodate upper tier demand functions, which are not just CES. So Feenstra, Russ, et al., they do 2 tiers of CES. I'm going to show you I could really accommodate a bunch of arbitrary demand functions at the upper tier. I'm going to show you a particular parametric form here, but it's not pinned down by that parametric form. It's just a particular form I choose. No, you could accommodate, and in fact, I'm going to show you exactly a non-homothetic case here. I'm not exploiting homotheticity at all. So I'm going to actually show you the upper tier is a non-homothetic CES in the sense of Coleman, Lashkari, and Metziari. And you could do other forms here. Nothing's pinned down per se by that functional form. Is there another question?
Yeah, just very quick. Is the
It's going to be US-wide. I'll give you some more details on that, but it's broadly US-wide. Yeah, okay. So then let me just give you a very quick preview, and then we'll go into this. So I'm going to estimate, importantly, that the micro and macro elasticities that I get are different statistically in basically nearly all my product categories. I'm going to get a median macro elasticity of something like 4, a bit below 4, and a median micro elasticity of something like 7. Okay, so this is different just from that Feenster-Russ et al. Paper where they could not reject that these two objects are different like 70% of their product categories. So I'm going to get a much more precise statement. These are the different objects. And I think in accordance with this literature's view that the micro one's smaller than the macro one. Although I'm clearly not getting a macro elasticity of 1, as in like a, more of a standard IRBC type calibration. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm going to go very briefly on the theoretical model I'm going to impose here, which is just this particular structure. I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail on the estimation, identification. I'll talk much more about the data, and then we'll go into the results, and then we'll be done. So any other questions at this stage? Everyone's sort of clear? Okay. Okay, so I have like one slide on the theory here. I'm not going to go through all the details. There's a draft of this paper on my website, so if you want to see more details, that's certainly available. What we're going to do here is a nested structure. So there's going to be a choice basically at the upper tier between a domestic product and a foreign product. And that could be governed by a number of different kinds of demand functions. I'm going to put down a particular one, which is a non-homothetic CS demand function in Komen-Lashkar-Metzieri. The utility function is defined implicitly by the equation on the slide. What's important is there's this sigma B, I'm going to call sigma B, is the macro elasticity between domestic and foreign products. And then there's this epsilon, which is going to be a measure of the income elasticity of domestic and foreign products. And so really what you should think about is if epsilon was 1, that's the homothetic case. That gets you back at CES, basically. And so this is really just a generalization of CES with the case where the epsilon is going to be different from 1. Okay? But then, conditional on choosing, say, a foreign product or a domestic product, it's going to be a CES aggregator where there's a sigma W, which is the elasticity among domestic products or the elasticity among foreign products. And so I'm going to call that the sort of micro elasticity. So that's the sense in which there's a macro elasticity and a micro elasticity. They're potentially different objects. We're going to let the data tell us, how different are these things. In addition, I do have this non-homothetic component here. And again, nothing really depends on this specific functional form. I could have chosen a number of other kinds of functional forms. The exact moment conditions you're going to get are going to be a little bit different, but nothing conceptually changes. It's the same kind of identification. I'm just going to choose this particular one for comparison with sort of this Feenster paper to have something that's easy to interpret. But in fact, you could make this far more rich in principle. If you have enough data, I don't need simply one parameter at the upper tier. You could have a number of country of origin specific parameters, for example. I'm not going to estimate that today, but nothing prevents that. Okay, so let's go to the estimation in just really like 3 slides here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to combine, yeah, please.
So at the top you just have domestic products.
Yeah.
And at the bottom is some perspective for the bottom.
Yes.
And the domestic.
Yeah, I mean, it's across varieties in both cases. So in the domestic case, it's just a particular domestic variety vis-a-vis another one. And in the foreign case, it's actually a particular foreign variety, not a particular foreign country.
And in the same in the foreign one, in the same elasticity distribution across varieties from a foreign country as across foreign countries.
Yeah, so the way the upper tier works is it's basically there's a block for foreign products, there's a block for domestic products, and I've got a elasticity across those two. And then conditional on foreign, it's all the foreign products from any origin with some elasticity. And then with domestic, it's all the all the domestic varieties with some elasticity. You could, in principle, do other things, but
But that would be different than in the most standard argument, when you would be aggregating across all varieties from a country, or you just have an elasticity across countries.
yeah. And I could have done a more standard thing. Yeah.
You can do this conditional estimate of the income elasticity, or it doesn't matter?
I'm going to recover all these parameters from the same set of moments simultaneously. No, I don't need anything directly in income. I'll show you how this is identified in 2 slides, but I'm going to identify them all simultaneously, same set of moments. Obviously, if you have a different parametric form, you'll get slightly different moments, right? And I'll show you how this works, but it's 2 slides. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to combine these 2 demand functions to get this particular representation, which is the demand for a particular variety. So let's just fix ideas. This is a particular barcode for beer, okay? This is a domestic barcode, specifically. So this is the % change in quantity demanded of this particular domestic beer. That depends on the change in price of that domestic beer. It also depends on the change in the price index for domestic beers as a whole. And of course, these elasticities could be different or the same. It depends on the price index for beer in the store as a whole, which depends on both domestic and foreign. And then depends on spending on beer in that particular store. And that has some elasticity, which is potentially different from 1. If this is equal to 1, this collapses to a standard homothetic domain function. Okay? So the key point here is I've got an error term. And that error term has a couple of demand shocks. Okay, this is the key thing. So I'm going to make one quick note. In standard Princeton 1984, you're doing a double differencing, and so you're going to kill this extra component in my demand shock. So that's kind of one difference. I'm leaving this extra component in, so it allows these other price index terms to show up. Otherwise, they're all killed. Okay, but what's in this error term is very simple. It's the demand shock for the particular barcode, and it's the demand shock for domestic beer in that store. I've already killed the variety-specific fixed effects by time differencing. This is just the change, the common change component that would otherwise have been killed in Princeton 1984. We clear so far? So to close the system, you make an assumption on the supply side. Okay, and I'm going to make actually a very simple assumption, very much in the spirit of the same original paper. I'm not doing anything fancy here. So we're going to have potentially marginal costs increasing with output with this elasticity omega. So omega governs the convexity of cost with respect to output. If omega is 0, costs are constant with respect to output. But generically, we think of them as potentially being upward sloping supply curves, and that's what omega is giving you. And then I'm going to difference basically within the average variety in the same store, same category, same manufacturer, and same origin. And so as long as markups vary only at the manufacturer, store, category, time level, I'm going to kill them. Okay? So what I'm ruling out here is a barcode-specific markup, which for most models, like Atkinson-Bernstein style, you would not get variation within manufacturers across barcodes. And similarly for stores, you wouldn't have that kind of variation in sort of standard models. But that is the restriction I'm ruling out. And what that leaves me is, again, an error term, which in this particular context is just the intercept term of the supply curve for a particular barcode and its idiosyncratic variation. Okay? That's the only thing left here. And so what I'm going to assume, and this is basically the exact same spirit of Princeton 1984, is there's orthogonality between this intercept and this error term. Okay? So this is the idiosyncratic component of the supply function, which is the intercept term. And it's already been differenced in 2 dimensions. And I'm assuming it's orthogonal with the demand function. That's particularly plausible in this case, more so than in other cases, because what's going on is I've got barcode level data. And characteristics at the product level are fixed. If the characteristics change, you issue a new barcode. So I know the characteristics are fixed, and I'm differencing out barcode level fixed effects, essentially. So I'm then going to argue that it's quite plausible that these residual supply curve shifts and my remaining demand curve shifts are orthogonal. That's less plausible in trade data, traditional trade data, where you don't have this kind of idea that the characteristics are fixed, and even conditional on fixed effects at country level, country HS10 level, there's probably residual product quality changes and things that would make this less plausible. But in scanner data, it's much more plausible. Okay? So then all you do is very simple. We have an orthogonality condition, and then this is basically the moment condition we have per variety, and you can do GMM by stacking this across varieties. This kind of depends on all these parameters. So just to give you some intuition of sort of how this is identified, the basic idea is as follows. You've got a term which is projected on a bunch of other moments. Okay? So in standard Princeton 1984, it's very simple. You're projecting the variance of prices on exactly 2 things on the right-hand side. So you're projecting the variance of prices on the variance of sales, basically the variance of quantities, and the covariance of price and quantities. Those are the 2 moments on the right-hand side of Princeton 1984. What's going on here is there's just a bunch of extra moments. And they're functions of the structural parameters. Right? So there's the covariance of prices and quantities, which is traditional moment in Princeton 1984. But now there's also a covariance between a barcode-specific price and domestic beer prices. There's a covariance between the store price index and variety-specific prices. There's a covariance between prices and sales, and between quantities and these other objects. And these additional covariances in the data will tell us something about the structural parameters of my domain function. That's basically what's going on. And so you've got this moment condition for each variety. Under the idea that these moments are different across barcodes, that they've got different variances effectively, then I can pool barcodes and get identification by effectively running a cross-sectional regression where I've got a bunch of moment conditions for each, one for each product. And so it's a cross-sectional regression across products. So if epsilon's 1, certainly the non-homotheticity is going to die. I still am going to have a sigma B and a sigma W, which in the existing literature, no one's doing simultaneously. So I'm going to still do that simultaneously.
No, exactly. Is it a matter of efficiency of the different estimation procedures?
Yeah, I mean, the way that the Finster paper in the literature does this, it effectively imposes orthogonality at both conditions, at both levels separately, which is a stronger restriction, I think, in a certain sense. Okay, so let's talk about the data for a second. Let me get to some results. So I'm using scanner data, originally weekly frequency. I'm going to go to quarterly frequency to get business cycle frequency. There's almost 63,000 barcodes in 2,500 stores across 47 markets in the US. I'm looking at 14 product categories in 48 quarters. So this is not the universe of consumer goods, but it's a broad representative cross-section of the US market. And then I'm going to get barcode country of origin data from Label Insight, which is a company that digitizes the product label, basically. And so that's where I'm getting this sort of country of origin information, and I'm getting this from 31 countries, including the US. So let me just give you a couple descriptive statistics on what that looks like, just because this is novel. So first off, what I'm showing you is for the first quarter, the last quarter, sorry, the first quarter of 2001, similar quarter in 2012, which is the last year, the share of foreign products in these particular 14 categories, just to give you some sense of what this looks like. So just for some rough comparison, in NIPA data as a whole, the import share of, say, food is something like 8% in 2001 and grows to about 13% in 2012. So in some categories, my import share is very similar, like razors or beer. In other categories, the import share is much lower. Okay, so part of what's accounting for this could be the fact that I don't know foreign value added, and that could be part of it. But in general, there's just a lot of consumer packaged products here for which, at least in 2001, the foreign share is not very high. It does grow, though, substantially by the end. So even in like something like soup, which was very small by 2001, it gets much bigger by the end of the sample. And so by the end here, you know, it's not exactly the same as the 13% in NIPA, but these are like broadly comparable objects. The other thing to think about is which countries are accounting for the biggest share of foreign sales in these categories. And there's not a ton of surprises. I'll just say that Mexico and Canada make up a huge component here, which is not perhaps entirely surprising. They're not exclusively accounting for things. Italy matters a lot in coffee, spaghetti sauce. You know, China makes a bunch of toothbrushes. But broadly, there's a lot of Mexican and Canadian products in this space. Okay, so let me just talk about the actual estimates I have in the last 5 minutes or so. So first off, I want to be clear. What I did and where these numbers come from is an unconstrained estimation of my system. Okay, so in principle, we might think there's a bunch of sign restrictions here. I think, in principle, we think all the sigmas should be positive. The supply curve should be upward sloping. The income elasticity should be positive, right? I impose no such restrictions at this time. Okay. If I did impose such restrictions, it doesn't change a ton. But I'm just going to show you transparently the completely unconstrained system. So with the exception of the between elasticity for Mayo, the signs of these sigmas are exactly what you'd hope to find. Demand slopes down, and in general, the between elasticity's got a median value across categories of about 4, and the within is much higher at about 7. And with the exception of like 2 categories, these 95% confidence intervals do not overlap. And so I can reject statistically that these are the same parameter, and generically, to just give some example like beer, I'm getting a value between something like 6 and 7.5 for the between, and the within is much higher, roughly between 10 and 11. So those are quite different distributions. Yeah.
What about sales? Do you get something pretty similar?
Yeah, in fact, I already am doing something like that, so I didn't go into super big details on this GMM, but I'm doing a one-step GMM where I'm prefixing the weight matrix, and my weighting is effectively a function of sales on the view that prices are better measured for higher sales products. So that's where this is coming from. You could do other weighting schemes, but to avoid small sample issues in optimal GMM, generically, I prefer doing a fixed weight matrix, and weighting by sales is one way to deal with that. Yeah, no, I haven't done it, but nothing prevents me. I mean, it's a data question, but in principle, I could do, say, annual frequency, or even a little bit lower frequency than that, and I could certainly test that. Yeah, I mean, this is not different from kinds of other estimates I've had in my own work at something like quarterly frequency barcode data. This is a function and part of the identification structure, right? So other identification approaches, if you know the Hottman instruments, for example, just generically give you smaller elasticities like always. So, I wouldn't say that frequency is always the key question here. It's kind of what's the source of variation. But nonetheless, at this frequency, this is the kind of structure I get. One thing just to complete the parameter set here, and I know we're almost out of time. Yeah, I'm basically getting homotheticity. I'm not rejecting homotheticity in most categories. There's a couple of exceptions, I think, in Mayo. So first off, I normalized the domestic product to have an elasticity of 1, so it's just relative to that. And foreign products are generically giving me elasticity close to 1, with just a couple of exceptions. So I'm not really rejecting homotheticity. One thing, the supply curve does slope the wrong sign when I unconstrain it. It's equivalent to basically saying marginal cost is flat, but it is a kind of a surprising direction. I can fix that again by constraining stuff. It doesn't change a whole lot, but that's a key thing here. No, no. I mean, I've differenced out what could be a rich set of markup variation, right? So there could be a lot of that. And then again, there is a idiosyncratic shock to the supply function for each product, and that's another source of price components. It's just that particular component, I'm assuming, is orthogonal to the demand function, right? So the only, you could imagine there's two sorts of endogeneity to the demand function. One is this upward sloping or downward sloping, and the other one is the markup component that I'm differencing out. Yeah. Great. So let me just very quickly say, relative to this Feenstra paper, my elasticities are not wildly different, with the exception that my microelasticity is much higher than theirs. So I'm getting something like 7, and they really get something very similar to their macroelasticity, you know, between 3 and 4. Which, I mean, given these distributions, it's not surprising that they can't reject that the elasticities are different, whereas I very clearly can. Okay, so then I know we've got 1 minute here. Just to recap what we talked about, I developed a new identification strategy to recover macro and micro elasticities simultaneously in a single set of moment conditions, apply it to novel US country of origin barcode data, and estimate that this macro and micro elasticities are statistically and economically different in nearly all of our product categories. So that's our contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the organizers for choosing the paper, and thank you to all of you for being here. So the paper I'm going to present is called Firm Export Dynamics in Interdependent Markets, and it's joint work with Alonso Alfaro, who is at the Costa Rican Central Bank, therefore the typical disclosure applies, with Juan Manuel Castro Vincenzi, who is a student at Princeton, and with Sebastián Fanelli, who is at FEP. So, as probably all of you know, there is a very large literature on firm export dynamics. And this is a literature that mostly focuses on understanding, within a particular destination country, what are the sources of path dependence? What is like the causal impact of a firm I exporting to a destination J at period T on the probability that this firm exports in the subsequent period to the same country J. Okay? And there are many papers. Some of them put the emphasis on learning. Some of them put the emphasis on customer capital accumulation. Some of them put the emphasis on sunk export cost. But among all these papers, there is a constant feature, and is that this literature typically assumes that export choices by firms are completely independent across destination markets. The decision that a firm is taken to export in Germany is not related at all to the decision that this firm is taken to export in, let's say, France. Okay? And all this is going to come from having constant marginal cost in the background and basically fixed and sunk costs that only vary by destination. Okay? At the same time, there starts to be a body of empirical evidence, mostly reduced form, that points in the direction of having some cross-country complementarities. This idea that when firms are exporting to a particular destination, something changes either in the structure of cost or in the information that makes the firm more likely to export to some other destination country. And at some level, this is not purely a theoretical oddity that the literature is starting to explore, but it's very much related to many things that are heard in the public discourse around trade policy. Okay? So I have here a couple of quotes. One idea is that whenever trade policy negotiators, they are negotiating free trade agreements, they have this idea that whenever a country is negotiating a free trade agreement with a destination, it's not just going to help to increase exports to that destination, but it's going to open the door to another set of markets. And this is a quote of the Minister of Economy of Costa Rica whenever they were dealing with the legislative approval of a free trade agreement between Costa Rica and Singapore, said, by consolidating our relationship with Singapore, this agreement gives us the possibility to increase our trade flows with other Asian countries. Okay? By the way, I picked Costa Rica because all throughout the paper we are going to be using data from Costa Rica. Okay? There you go. Okay?
But then another of these ideas, in a little bit more of a subtle form, it became also quite prominent in relationship to Brexit. Okay? It was this idea that if free trade agreements, because they make countries to have common regulations, create some sort of cross-country complementarities between the members of a deep free trade agreement, whenever you break up this free trade agreement, you actually should expect exports from third-party countries not to go up, as the typical trade model would predict, but to go down. Or at least there will be a forces that will bring exports from third-party countries to go down. And again, this is something that UNCTAD had kind of in mind, that third country effects could be affected by increasing regulatory divergence. If the UK's regulation divert over time from the EU's, trade costs would rise for third countries due to production process adjustment and potential duplication of proofs of compliance. Okay? So this kind of intuitions is something that our models have a hard time addressing. Typically, exports between different origins to a destination, they are substitutes, they are not complex. Okay? So mostly what we are going to try to focus on this paper is answering the question, are these cross-country complementarities quantitatively important? There is some suggestive evidence that those are there, but once we look at them through the lens of a model, do they matter? How much they explain of trade flows? This sort of question. So in the interest of time, because it's a short presentation, I'm going to be skipping details on several parts of the paper, but I want to give you like the summary of what the whole paper entails, and then we are going to focus on particular parts. Okay? So as I was saying, the data we are going to be using is going to be Costa Rica for the period 2005 to 2015, and the data that we have is basically for every firm located in Costa Rica, we see to which countries they export, and if they export to some country, how much they export in sales, in revenues. Okay? The first part that I'm going to show you is some sort of model-free reduced form evidence, again, suggestive of the presence of complementarities in export decisions between destinations. Okay? So where would you start? The most typical thing is, okay, you think there are complementarities. Do you observe firms exporting to countries that are similar to each other? And that's pretty easy to find the data. The answer is yes. Okay. Within firm, at the firm level, you will observe that firms tend to export to countries at the same point in time that have some characteristics in common. Either they are geographically close, or they are linguistically close, or they are members of a common deep free trade agreement. Okay? And obviously, although this is consistent with the presence of cross-country complementarities, we can all think of many other explanations that would explain this cross-country correlation. In particular, you may think that there are some features of the profit function of firms when they export that I'm not controlling for, and that they could be correlated across destination countries, and this could explain this cross-country correlation in export decisions. So in a second aspect in the paper, we show something that is a bit more targeted to the presence of cross-country complementarities. And this idea that try to control as much as you can for the characteristics of the destination, then you would observe that firms are more likely to export to destinations whose neighbors are large, whose neighbors are good export destinations. I mean, the idea that you want to have in mind is that Switzerland is in the center of Europe, move Switzerland to the center of the Atlantic, good exports to Switzerland drop. And what our analysis would say is that yes, they would drop. Switzerland benefits holding constant Switzerland, all the characteristics of Switzerland, because it's close to other countries that are large, and this is something that will point towards the presence of complementarity. Okay. Once we have this reduced form evidence in mind, I will go structural, and we are going to try to, what is the main goal of the paper, that is to quantify how important these complementarities are. Okay. So in particular, and this I'll show you a bit more in detail, we are going to build a partial equilibrium dynamic model that is going to have these cross-country complementarities. Firms in our model, they are going to internalize both the fact that they are dynamics, and in our case, dynamics are going to come from sunk export costs, and the fact that there are cross-country complementarities whenever they decide where to export at each point in time. Okay? And something, and this is going to give a relatively complicated problem that the firms have to solve, and one of the tricks that you could think is like, well, you can make this tractable just by assuming perfect foresight all throughout, and this will solve part of the computational complications. But I'll show you that you don't need to do that. Okay? So we will actually allow firms to be uncertain about some payoff relevant variables, and in particular, firms are going to have rational expectations, and I'll try to hint a bit how we are doing. Again, in the interest of time today, it will take me probably the 20 minutes to explain the algorithm, but I'll try to give you a bit some idea of how we solve this problem. Okay? And then all throughout also, because in some way, this is not just about knowing how to solve the model, but we care about the answer per se. in the same way as I said, well, you need to be careful because whenever I show you this cross-country correlation, you may think that this is not complementarities at all, this is just correlation in unobservables. All throughout the model is going to allow for correlation in unobservables in order to separately identify what is this correlation in unobservables and what is this cross-country complementarity. Yes, all throughout. So at some point there's going to be, just quickly, there's going to be some fixed export cost, and I'm going to assume that these ones are lower if you're exporting to countries that are similar in some dimension. So it's going to be a payoff relevant saving in cost kind of a story. Okay? And again, it goes very much along this regulatory convergence, right? In the idea like you have a product, you adjust it to some particular standards that are required in order to sell the product in one market. Once you adjusted your product to those standards, then you can sell in other markets where the standards are the same, and then it's much cheaper than if the standards were to be very different. Okay, so that's it. What are we going to find? What we are going to find is that these cross-country complementarities is pair-specific for a pair of countries. Well, it's going to be very heterogeneous across pairs. There are going to be some pairs that maybe initially you could think that the complementarities could be large. Let's pick Korea and China. No, in fact, in this case, they are going to be very small. Pick Canada and the US, they're going to be a bit larger. In that case, the reduction in fixed costs in the US is 3.5%. Where are truly the complementarities being focused in our estimation across European countries? Okay. You pick European countries, at that point, exporting to France reduces cost in Germany 9%, but these countries, in the way that we have modeled it, these savings in cost, they accumulate. So if you don't export only to France, but you export to France and Switzerland, now your reduction in cost in Germany is not 9%, but it's going to be 16%. Okay? And I'll show you some sort of maps what you will see at the end, like which countries benefit more or less.
But you said that this is regulatory and not necessarily something like you might, if you know how to market to Chinese customers, you might also know how to market to Korean customers. Is it because you get it strongly across Europe, or where is the identification for those?
Totally. So the identification is a bit gonna come from distinguishing these two possible ways of estimating, right? So we are gonna, the justification of the complementarities is gonna be very much related. You export to China, let's say, because Japan is very large, or maybe I should. You export to Korea because China is very large, right? And that is that's orthogonal to the fact that, well, you are good at selling to both markets, right? Because if you were good to selling to both markets, you will be equally good no matter whether China is large or small, right? So if you are good to selling to markets that are close to each other, right? But in one case, one market that is a neighbor is very large and the other one is very small, well, the one that has a large neighbor, you are going to have a bigger effect on the exports, right? So this targets the complementarities. Then any residual spatial correlation will be attributed to these unobserved profits. So in some way, the correlation is going to be targeting the correlation in unobserved profits, the story that you have in mind. Moments of the second kind are going to target more the complementarities.
Suppose that destinations have different kinds of preferences and different characteristics. What you're capturing in the second point is actually about similarity of preferences, because perhaps these countries have similar cases to it. Can we really separate that component?
Yeah. So again, just think that there is a correlation structure in preferences in space. So two countries that are close to each other, on average, they tend to have the same similarity in preferences, right? Therefore, if you are good at targeting certain set of characteristics, you are more likely to export to it. So that's the first bullet point. That's the first identification. No? But now hold constant that, and now two countries will always have similar preferences, but in some cases your neighbor is large, and in some cases your neighbor is small. When your neighbor is large, you are more likely to export to that destination per se, although the correlation in the structure is always the same. This is the second bullet point. This is what will allow us to identify the complementarities.
But do you have enough variation in that? Like, are enough Costa Rican firms exporting to Korea first and then to China that allows you to...
So this is a bit different. This is about dynamics, right? So now it's like, once you say that, right, if you think that now we're in the realm of cross-country complementarities, and now you're telling me, are there some source of dynamics in the sense like, is it like at the same point in time, or are these complementarities over different intervals? Maybe in order to gain these complementarities, you first export to Korea and then to China. Let me get back to that. So in the structure, it's going to seem that it's at the same point in time, but I'll show you that the model can predict that kind of behavior. Okay, I'll get back. Okay, so then quickly, what are the main results that we are going to find? So once we have this model, the estimated model, we are going to perform 3 types of counterfactual experiments. Okay? So one is, take the estimated model. There are going to be some parameters that capture cross-country complementarities, set them down to 0 while holding all the other parameters constant, resimulate them in your model, what will happen? So what is going to happen is that export events, number of observations, firm country years with positive exports will be 12% lower, revenues will be 5% lower. So that's kind of the ballpark quantification of how much this matters for exports. Are there third market effects? Yes, there seem to be important third market effects in this partial equilibrium sense. Okay? So in particular, we are going to simulate one aspect of Brexit, that is this regulatory divergence between the UK and the EU. And whenever we do that, we are going to observe that exports, we are going to observe that exports to the UK, they are going to drop around 5–6%, while the EU is pretty much not affected. Okay? And there is something in the background of everything that is like smaller countries are much more affected by these cross-country complementarities by large markets. And then, now imagine that you are a researcher, that you just do the typical counterfactuals that we typically do. Let's say there is a reduction in tariffs and we want to show what will happen to exports from a country of origin. In this case, the translation of this is we are going to have Costa Rica joining the CPTPP. And imagine that you were to do this through the lens of a model that doesn't have cross-country complementarities, right? You re-estimate your model without complementarity. Would the answer matter? Well, in some cases it will, in some cases it won't. And if I have time, I'll go in detail over why, but just to give you like one summary, if you were to do it with the current version of CPTPP, you will actually get very similar numbers in the model with and without complementarities. And this is basically because these countries have very few complementarities with other countries outside of the area. But in the hypothetical world in which the US had never withdrawn, then Costa Rica joined the CPTPP with the US, you will get very different predictions in the model with complementarities and without complementarities. Okay. So let me go quickly in detail. As you see, there are a couple of things that I'm not going to be discussing today. They're in the paper. Let me describe them all. Okay? So the model that you have in mind, that's Roberts and Tybalt, like this model where there is basically fixed and sunk cost of exporting, is going to be a generalization of that framework. Okay? So in these models, what is the key object is what are the profits that a firm I would obtain in a destination J at a period T if it were to export to it. Okay? And in all these models, basically these profits are a function of some potential gross profits, that is basically revenues minus the variable cost of exporting, minus a fixed cost, minus a sunk cost that you pay only if you did not export to that destination in the previous period. So let me describe each of these three ingredients a bit in detail. Okay? So the potential gross profits, here we are going to have nothing particularly new. So in the same way as that's Roberts and Tybalt, you impose constant marginal cost in the background, monopolistic competition, CS demand, and you basically get an expression for the potential gross profits, well, this 1 over the elasticity of substitution multiplied by the potential revenues. You impose some projection of variable trade cost or iceberg trade cost on observables, and you are basically going to get an expression for revenues.
So if you export 2 years ago, then you stop for a year, and then you export again, you have to pay the same cost again.
Yeah, in these frameworks, this typically happens. We could generalize that for 1 extra year because it doesn't increase the state space that much. But there is this previous paper by Roberts and Tybalt where they kind of say that it's 1 year the thing that matters the most. But yeah. Fixed cost, this is where all the action is going to be. Okay? So the fixed cost is going to have 4 components. Okay? And again, I'll go over one of each of these 4 components kind of in detail. Okay? So the first term is G, what is, we don't know, like the gravity component. So fixed cost will depend on how far away the destination J is from the home market of the firm. In this case, the home market, we index it by H, is Costa Rica. And for us, far away, we are projecting distance on 3 dimensions. So it can be geographically far away, it can be linguistically far away, or it can be far away in a regulation sense, okay? And regulation sense for us is basically how deep is the deepest trade agreement between destinations H and J, okay? The key novelty is the second component that we call like extended gravity, okay? And basically says, the fixed cost for a firm I of selling a destination J at period T may be smaller, has a minus sign, if this firm is exporting to other destinations J prime. This Y is a dummy variable that takes value 1 if firm I is exporting to J prime. So if a firm is exporting to J prime, your cost of exporting to J are reduced in the term in parentheses. And this term in parentheses is basically how complements countries G and J prime are in geography, how complements they are in language, and how complements they are in these free trade agreements or regulatory sets. Okay? And now the whole question is, well, how do you model these complementarities? Okay? So a natural way that you may think that we will model this is, well, some parameter, some level effect that we want to estimate, and some exponential decay in the distance between countries G and J prime. And because I'm going to need to impose complementarities all throughout, this parameter would have to be larger or equal to 0. A generalization of this that we're actually going to do is, well, allow the decay to vary across different sources, geography, linguistic, or regulatory, and estimate this decay. This is what we are going to do. And a third generalization that probably you could think that would make sense that we are going to do also is that, well, these complementarities are not going to hold constant for every pair of countries, but if this pair of countries is very far away from Costa Rica, maybe those complementarities could be larger. Just think like, imagine two countries that have the same regulation as Costa Rica. Well, all these firms are already selling in Costa Rica. How much of a cost advantage you are going to get for selling to this country? Probably not much. So then allow for an interaction term with the distance between Costa Rica and the destination. And this is the form that we are going to use. Okay? The third term is an unobserved term, and this is the one that I was saying from an identification perspective, we need to be careful. Maybe the reduction in fixed cost or the correlation that we observe is not due to this extended gravity component, but is due to correlation in unobservables. So we are going to allow for an unobserved term that is going to be potentially correlated across destinations between any two destinations J and J prime, according to a functional form that is going to mimic the functional form that I just described to you for the complementarity. And then there is going to be a fourth term that is basically like an exit shock. Okay, there is going to be like a parameter there that is going to help us match exit rates that basically says, well, with some probability this parameter is equal to 0, but with some probability this parameter is equal to infinity. It is as if you were to have a fixed cost of infinity, then you cannot export. Okay? And we need this because otherwise we will have a hard time matching exit rates in the frame. Okay? This is fixed cost. Sunk costs are void. Okay? Sunk cost is just like the gravity component of fixed cost with different parameters. They just depend on distance. Okay? And I'll go back to your question, Mauricio, about the dynamics in a minute. Okay? So firms, among all possible bundles of potential destination countries, they need to pick the bundle that they like the most. Okay? And the bundle that they like the most, they do it by maximizing the expected discounted sum of current and future profits. Okay? And firms are going to have perfect information on many payoff relevant variables except on these exit shocks. Okay? So there is going to be one element of the payoff relevant function on which they don't have perfect information and they need to form expectations. Okay? So if I wanted to describe quickly what is the value function of the firm is going to have some value function that is going to depend on the set of countries they were exporting yesterday. It's going to depend on this whole vector of fixed cost in every country. They are going to sum static profits, where the static profits in every destination J will depend on what they are doing in the other destinations. And then they are going to need to compute the expectation over these omegas of the value function. Okay? So this is a problem that it will be computationally complicated for three reasons. One, the choice is complicated. You are picking a bundle among all possible bundles. So it's one element in a set that basically has 2 to the power of j elements. Okay? On top of that, because firms don't have perfect information, they need to compute the expectation over a value function. And what you are computing the expectation is this future omega that, again, because it can be high or low in every country, has 2 to the power of j points of support. And then in general, if you wanted to compute the policy function, there will be many points to compute over the policy function. Okay? So again, just because it's a short presentation, I won't be able to go in detail, and I'm very happy to discuss about it, how we do it. In the paper, we spend many pages about this. But it's just, if you have in mind like these papers that in static frameworks have tried to use the supermodularity of objective functions in order to solve problems that have feature 1, basically what we are trying to do is to generalize these procedures to problems that not only have feature 1, that this is well known in the literature, but also to account for features 2 and 3. Okay? But there is basically like a bounding procedure, blah, 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 and happy to discuss about it more. But for this presentation, prefer not to give too many. Okay? So then, let me just give you like a quick summary of the results. So now, one thing that now we have estimated, in my end, I skip these parts, we solve this model, we do a simulated method of moments, we estimate these parameters. And I want to describe to you what are the reduction in fixed costs that you would observe. Okay? So again, the object that we are estimating is bilateral for every pair of countries. Again, there is a question of how can I convey to you the information. So one way I'm gonna convey to you the information is, well, give me each country J, find the closest neighbor, so the country J prime, for which the total sum of the complementarities are as large as possible, and then tell me what's that of a share of the gravity component of fixed cost that firms will face. And what you observe is that darker colors are in Europe, and in particular countries like Austria are gonna have a reduction in cost that may go up to 70%. Again, it's because Germany is really close to Austria, right? So this idea that we think of Germany and Austria as different countries, for sure there is a border, but from the perspective of the exporting firms in Costa Rica, where they look at countries as a bundle of characteristics, they are pretty similar. You need to adjust the label to a particular language, you need to adjust about how to ship your goods to a particular place in Europe, and you need to adjust to particular regulations. Well, those happen to be very close between these two countries, right? But you go to other places, and while in Europe you see a lot of complementarities going on, well, you go to other places and this yellow color basically implies very little complementarities. Okay? So you may benefit from complementarities because you have one neighbor that is a really good neighbor, or you may benefit from complementarities because you have many neighbors that are so-so, right? So this is what I'm trying to show here. So here I'm gonna say, for each destination J, tell me how many of other countries J prime gives you a reduction in fixed cost of at least 5%. Okay? And now the picture changes quite a bit. Europe still has many neighbors. They have many good neighbors because there is this deep free trade agreement that implies big saving in cost. All countries are close to each other. But now you start to have other countries also benefiting. In particular, Mexico appears like an outlier. And the reason is that Mexico has many deep free trade agreements with many countries. So actually, although from geography is relatively isolated, from the regulatory aspect, it actually has many neighbors, yeah, and it will benefit in many dimensions. Okay? I wanted to go back to Mauricio's question. So we have the complementarities in the fixed cost, right? So it seems like all the saving in cost will be happening at the same point in time if you're exporting to two countries at the same point in time, not the idea at the beginning that you first go to Korea, 3 years later you go to Japan. Okay? However, you can see that the dynamics, that because they are dynamics country by country, you are going to have something that looks pretty similar to the story that you had in mind. In order to show you this, I'm going to simulate the model in a very simplistic case where there are only 3 destinations, just in France, Germany, and Switzerland. Okay? And these 3 countries are basically the complementarities between themselves are basically the same, and then the only thing that is different is that Switzerland is much smaller than France and Germany. Okay? So I get this model, I simulate some sort of a steady state. These are the underlying probabilities to the 3 countries. And now I'm going to do this experiment. The experiment I'm going to do is the next day these firms wake up and I'm going to tell them, in 3 years, France is going to be very productive. Sorry, your profits in France are going to be very high, but in 3 periods. Okay? So the fact that we have the sunk cost of exporting to France generates these dynamics that you say, in 3 periods I want to be in France. So some firms will start already to export today. Okay? But because some firms are already starting to export today, you can see that although nothing is changing in countries, Germany and Switzerland, some firms are also starting to export to Switzerland and to Germany today. Okay? So you are going to have these dynamic cross-country effects, although the complementarities are only coming from fixed cost and you need to export into more. Okay? And that's one point, and the other one, I won't emphasize much, but again, just in the interest of time, you can see that Germany and Switzerland, they haven't been shocked here. The only shock is to France. Okay? Their complementarities to France are basically the same, but Switzerland, in general, you see that goes above, again, because there is a strong force in the model that the small countries benefit much more from complementarities than large countries.
So when you estimate the model, you estimate
No, so in the estimate, because it's partial equilibrium, so we estimate on the whole path. Okay? Only when I'm doing this simplification, I'm saying, hold constant over time, some shifters, so that I have a sort of a steady state, and I can do a clean experiment. But the model is estimated on the dynamics. Okay? So again, in the last 3 minutes, let me just summarize the punchline. So do these complementarities matter? In the end, this is the goal. Like the reduced form that was previously in the literature, what was not in the literature is a model that could incorporate these complementarities and that we could solve. Okay? So do they matter in the end? Well, if you look at the extensive margin, they matter 12%. If you look at the overall impact on revenues, this is 5%. Of the three sources, which is the one that matters the most? Geography. So if you were to have only the complementarities in geography, you will get basically half of the extensive and of the intensive margin. Between language and regulatory convergence of deep free trade agreements, you will observe that free trade agreements are a bit more important than language, but basically it's a quarter. But again, there is this very strong heterogeneity across countries. If you were to think which are the countries where flows are growing due to these complementarities, again, darker colors, you see that a lot of it is focused on Central Europe, right? And in this case, for these countries, the impact can be large. There are some of these countries in which they receive exports, a big volume of exports, just because their neighbors are large, or neighbors, again, in geography, linguistic, or free trade agreement. Brexit, so of the whole thing of Brexit, only take one dimension, that is the UK and the EU regulatory start to become different. Okay? What will happen to flows from Costa Rica to these countries? You can see that in general, the European Union, because it's a large area and it still has a lot of complementarities between the EU countries, nothing will happen, okay? Or very little. But the UK will suffer more, okay? 5% reduction in the extensive margin, 1.7 in the total margin. Okay? And there was this discussion of maybe some countries within the European Union are going to be affected, and that's true. There is some heterogeneity across countries within the European Union because of the geography. You can see that Belgium and Ireland are a bit more affected than the average country of the European Union, but they're still much less than the UK. Okay? Then let me just 1 minute for the last exercise. So the last exercise is Costa Rica actually very recently started the procedure to join CPTPP. So you may want to know what will happen if Costa Rica were to join CPTPP. So two things will happen here. One is tariffs from exports from Costa Rica to the CPTPP members will go down. Two, the regulation will have to adjust. The CPTPP is a deep trade agreement. Okay? So try to determine what will happen in a model like the one we estimated, and in a model that you say has no cross-country complementarities whatsoever. Okay? So whenever you do that, and put in red, one is the extensive margin, the other one is the total effect, you can see that these two numbers are kind of small. Are kind of similar. So it seems you will not be missing much if you had ignored the whole cross-country complementarities. Okay? And why is that? Well, the reason is because even in the model with complementarities, the exports that you generate to countries that are not in the CPTPP area are very small because the CPTPP countries are relatively isolated according to our measures, so they don't have many cross-country complementarities with others, neither between themselves, to be honest. They are actually quite far apart from each other. Linguistically, they are different. So there is not much going on. But now imagine that this had happened in the world in which the US never withdrew from CPTPP. Right? Well, at that point, now you start to see that now the differences between the model with and without complementarities are very different. And why is that? It's because exports naturally to the US now will grow by a lot. Now tariffs to the US are going down if Costa Rica joins a trade agreement where the US is also there. And the US is such a large country that has quite a few complementarities with the current members of CPTPP, that this huge growth, that this moderate growth into the US gets translated into a huge growth to the other countries. So at this point, the models with and without complementarities would be very different. Let me conclude. So what we do is provide a partial equilibrium dynamic model that has these cross-country complementarities. We use it to quantify the importance of the complementarities, and we present an algorithm that at some level is more general. It's just about solving the single-agent dynamic discrete choice problems with cross-choice complementarities. And in part, the part I want to conclude is like, we think of this paper just as one step in a research agenda that at some level is much broader, right? In some way, once you start to see that these models can be solved, there are many other features that maybe you would like to modify. One is, we are allowing for some sort of rational expectations. There is some variables that are unknown, but we're still holding constant. We're still assuming perfect information on many variables. You may want to know how far we could go relaxing the perfect foresight assumption. We would also like to know that, probably, right? But there are other things. Then you could say, well, we just model cross-country interdependencies in one particular way through the fixed cost. But maybe you don't want to put it through the fixed cost. Maybe it's information. Maybe firms go to a country and they learn about their demand shifter in other countries. Or maybe it should be going on the variable trade cost. Or maybe there shouldn't be complementarities. Maybe in the short run there are substitutabilities. If you export to one country, maybe your marginal cost in other countries go down, right? So in some way there is a whole set of questions in this literature of complementarities that are completely open. And at some level, all throughout, we are only doing partial equilibrium stuff. So you could think that if these complementarities are not just for Costa Rica, but every country experiences these complementarities, from a general equilibrium perspective, the counterfactors that we typically do could be quite different. Okay? So in some way, we just see this as a step in this more general research agenda of enriching the patterns of complementarities between countries. Okay? Thank you so much.
Can I ask you a final question?
Yeah.
So I guess like testing for these other alternative complementarities structurally requires a lot more than, but in the critical papers you were showing before, is there anything that points towards more extensive margin than complementarity?
It's a great question. So it depends on which one you do. So if you do substitutabilities, here there is a little bit of an evidence. So I have this paper on Spain on exporting, where a demand shock in Spain, actually firms that receive a bigger demand shock in Spain, they seem to export less. Or firms that receive a more negative demand shock in Spain, they seem to export more. This points at least some substitutabilities between the domestic and the foreign market. Testing for the variable cost, I'm not sure people have done. I mean, the reason why it's much harder is because if you really want to pin down the variable cost, you need to get well the selection bias that some firms export and others not, and it's a bit of a mess.
Thanks everyone for showing up. Thanks Manu for putting together this session. I'm going to present today this joint work with Axel and Gaston on, it's called Escaping the Losses from Trade, the Impact of Heterogeneity in Skill Acquisition, and the usual disclaimer applies. So the paper is basically motivated by this, extensive literature that has documented the distributional consequences of trade and the fact that, after trade shocks, basically different people go through very different experiences, and they can either different gains or in some cases even some losses. And in particular, there are tons of papers that I'm not going to go over. Some of them are on the slides that have basically documented these uneven effects. At the same time, there's also, starting after those papers, an extensive body of work that has, tried to understand the margins of adjustment that workers have available in order to adjust after these shocks, right? So thinking in terms of just a few examples, if you think about regional migration, some papers have basically tried to, look at that margin of adjustment. If, these trade shocks, in particular import competition shocks, affect some regions more than others, then you would in principle see workers adjust by, migrating. There's a lot of work on this issue, including some work by Mauricio, and actually he's going to talk about this later. More traditionally, the industry switching occupations, that's also something out there. That's also, a lot of people have looked at that margin. And, in general, there's, a lot of interest in understanding this process of adjustment after these large globalization shocks or import competition shocks. So in this paper, what we're interested in is what, the margin or a particular margin of adjustment that is available to future generations of workers. All these papers basically have focused on current workers, that are basically in different occupations, industries, or, where the heterogeneity is basically already there at the time of the shock. Now we want to understand a little bit more about how new generations of workers can adjust. And the way we're going to do that in this paper is by looking in particular at skill acquisition. And by skill acquisition, what I mean is college enrollment in the US. And we're going to focus on this margin of adjustment and try to understand if it's actually a relevant margin of adjustment after these trade shocks. So if you think in terms of the China shock, for example, it's a shock that if you go back to like ADH in these papers, it started in the 90s and it went through like 2010. It's been a few years since then. So basically the question is, do we see the kids of these workers doing something differently? And that's what we're going after here. And so one of the key features of trying to understand this margin, or one of the key features that you need to take into account, is the fact that going to college is a costly investment, in particular in the US. So it implies that you have to sacrifice consumption, and therefore it brings a set of issues on the table that we have to take into account. And in particular, we have these two questions, or we address these two questions in the paper. The first one is more like an empirical question, which is, do trade shocks affect college decisions? When we started working on this, we were kind of surprised that there actually wasn't a lot of work, empirical work, trying to document, the effects on, particularly on college enrollment. I'm going to tell you why that's the case, or why we think that was the case, and how we go around those issues. And then the second question is, well, does it matter for welfare? How important is this in terms of like intergenerational effects? Do the fact that new or the kids of workers can go to college, does it matter for how welfare differences are going to change over time? Okay, so we're going to do two things, as related to the previous two questions that we have. The first one is that we're going to basically estimate the effects of the China shock on college enrollment. To do that, we're going to basically take an approach where we first look at the effects of the China shock on labor market opportunities, and and then based on those, we're going to say, okay, well, this should in principle generate, have effects on college enrollment, and then we're going to look directly at college enrollment. And then I'm going to basically propose a model, which is going to be a dynamic trade model with heterogeneous households. Why the heterogeneous households? Because we want to understand, decisions to make this investment. And when it comes to investment, it is important to understand, basically the wealth or wealth distribution of households before they make this investment. And so we're going to basically embed a simple trade model into this, Ghai type models, where we're going to have multiple regions. We're going to consider a small open economy, and on top of that, we're going to add the more traditional costly switching across local labor markets that people have been using a lot in the literature. Yeah.
So I think like there are two potential mechanisms I can think about. One is like an income effect. I just have less cash on hand for the family, so I cannot. Another mechanism is a change in relative wages and sectors and kind of.
This paper is all going to be about the second one.
Okay.
So we're basically, what we're going to do is, in the model, I'm going to show you that there are differences in the wage, not exactly the wage premium, but the income premium across, the college, basically the skill distribution in the US for what we call seasonal workers. And then from that motivates our model, which is going to have the very traditional Stokes-Samuelson effect, which is going to, after the shock, it's going to generate an increase in the college premium. And that increase in the college premium is going to generate the increase. But yeah, there are other papers that have shown different things, like, either income effects or, we've had many people ask us about, there are papers that have shown that, the more affected regions by the China shock also went through, a decline in public good provisions and stuff like that. So that's an issue that, at least the way we think about it, is that it matters more for high school students that are about to graduate. And when I talk more about how we estimate the effect, I'll talk a little bit more about these things. Okay. So this is what we're going to do. What we find, in case I run out of time, so I'm going to show you that, this import competition shocks are more detrimental for less educated workers. There's already a little bit of this in the literature, so I don't want to spend too much time there. But what we bring on the table that is completely new is that, the younger cohorts respond by acquiring more education. And what was even more surprising to us, and which is super clear in the data, is that only high-income families are the ones that can actually send their kids to college. So actually, we didn't think about this until afterwards, which is that, this trade shock or this China shock gives you a pretty clean shock in order to understand the effects of, say, the wealth distribution in terms of skill acquisition going forward. That's something we bring on the table as well. In terms of the model, I'm going to show you what we have so far. We've been working on the calibration a lot, and it's a hard model to calibrate because there are too many things moving around. But in general, I think the broad results are, the shock is going to generate an increase in the wage premium, which is going to generate the increase in college enrollment by new cohorts. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the role of like transfers in the model, and the fact that that's something that we can actually also see in the data. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how relevant this endogenous skill acquisition margin is in order to basically dampen the uneven effects of the trade shock. All right. Yeah. No, I think you could. I would need some different data in order to do that I don't have access to. But in principle, you could do that if you had the right data. Because, I mean, I'm restricting myself to like the ADH shock, but if you want to do other types of shocks, then maybe you can use other data. But yeah, that's something that we thought about as well. Like, the differences. If you were in manufacturing, do you stay in manufacturing or not? These types of things are something that, I think there's a lot of room to understand the intergenerational effects of the trade shock. And I think also that's where ADH are going with their latest paper on the persistence of the challenge. Yeah.
I guess like this framework will be also useful to think about the effects of skill bias technological change in what.
So exactly, here we use the particular trade shock to generate the increase in the wage premium, but in principle, we could have added just like skill bias technical change and generate, the same increase in the wage premium and see how that would generate changes in the college. Now, I think that the trade shock is much cleaner in the sense that you actually see the changes in trade flows, right? Okay, so I'm going to skip the literature review except for this last part, because there are a bunch of newer papers that have been starting to bring together this, like heterogeneous agent models and incomplete markets with trade, starting with a work by Mike Wu and his co-author, and Elisa also has a paper there and a few people. So it seems like an interesting area to start thinking about these heterogeneous effects of trade and how the wealth distribution matters. Okay, so in terms of the evidence, probably most of you know how the ADH shock is constructed. Just a super quick review. It's basically just what they do is we're gonna exploit the heterogeneity in import penetration across different regions in the U.S. In particular, the level of the unit of observation is going to be a local labor market, and across local labor markets, the way the import penetration shock is constructed is just by taking the total imports from China into the U.S. at the sectoral level, and then across regions, the way that those aggregate changes in imports are weighted is basically by just labor shares, okay, in different industries. So you can see here, this is the change in imports from China into the U.S. in industry I, and then you take that per capita, and then you weight those using the region-specific labor shares across industries. So it's basically like in a way, it's like a Bardic shock. But then on top of that, we're going to instrument it the same way that ADH does, which is by using imports from into other developed countries from China, and then using the lagged labor shares. And we're going to have 722 commuting zones for these 2 periods or 10-year periods, not exactly 10-year periods, but from 1990 to 2000, 2007, that's basically going to be our shock. So how are we going to do this? Just follow the usual methodology, and we're going to do the diff and diff estimation, where the left-hand side is just going to be the outcome of interest. And we're going to be interested in their coefficient. No, we're going to do the usual 2000. So we're going to do the stacked, diff and diff. Sorry? Sorry? Exactly. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is basically, I'm going to show you today the results for income, because I think that's basically what we're, in terms of labor market opportunities, that's what matters the most. What we want, so relative to the existing work, we want to focus on what we call seasonal workers, which are workers between 30 and 55 years old. And so why? Because we think that this is more like a relevant group of people that, you know, if you're about to go to make a skill acquisition decision, then you might be looking at these more seasoned workers rather than the younger ones. And for education decisions, we're going to look at, you know, this is the usual thing you do in the literature, you look at 18 to 25 years. Okay. And, you know, the data comes from the ACS, and eventually I'm going to show you what other data we use, because that's going to be key. And we instrument the import penetration shock in the usual. Okay, so 2 facts, very quick. I'm just going to show you one. You know, labor income decreases after the China shock. This, you know, everybody knows about that. Now, what's a little bit more interesting is once you start looking at this across different levels of education, you know, you can see right here that for those with lower levels of education, the shock is you know, pretty bad and strong across local labor markets. Once you look at, you know, those with a bachelor degree, basically the effect is not there, or is not statistically significant. So, you know, you can, I'm showing you this way, but we could have also estimated basically on like the income premium, where we had just like computed the income premium as the difference of these two, and you would get also like a very. Oh, some college includes these two. It doesn't matter if you go to sorry? Exactly, yeah. So this includes more people, yeah. All the dropouts. And, you know, there's an extensive literature that has shown that dropouts have actually increased as well. So here we focus on enrollment only, and we don't go into that, the dropout issue, or graduation rates. So, I mean, this is the first, you know, in terms of labor market opportunities, it seems pretty clear that, you know, the China shock generated a differential effect between workers with different education levels. In the paper, we also show it for employment, and it's pretty clear as well. So now, we want to go, you know, once I've shown you this, so one would expect that there would be effects on college enrollment by new generations of workers. And so, what is the big issue with, and this is what we, you know, was the main challenge in estimating this, is what's the main issue when you want to estimate the effects of the China shock on college enrollment? And it's basically that students who want to, or high school graduates who want to go to college, they migrate a lot. So they go to different places. So this local labor market approach, definitely is, you know, the identification becomes much more harder. And there's just a simple fact that about 50% of kids in the US who go to college, they basically go to a college that is over 100 miles away from where they went to high school, where they graduated from high school. So to kind of go around this issue, we're going to take 2 approaches. The first one is we can use the ACS data, and you know, this is like an imperfect kind of solution, but you can look at where these kids were located a year or 5 years ago, depending on if you use the ACS or the census. So we're basically going to use that to link the shock to where you were before you go to college. And the other one is that we're going to go to individual level PSID data. And then it's much easier because then we can actually follow high school graduates where they move. We can follow them exactly where they are going. Okay, so, you know, we find a positive effect and statistically significant. We also look at not only at enrollment in T, but also in T+1, and the effect becomes stronger, even though a little bit less statistically significant. Again, these numbers are pretty close to. There's a paper by Green and Lopestri where they look at this, but for high school graduation rates. And that's much easier because, you know, kids don't move after they graduate high school, but the numbers are in the same ballpark. Now, when we go to the PSID data, as I mentioned before, the nice thing is that we can follow, you know, high school graduates, and we can actually look at like the marginal, you know, we'll exactly only look at those students who graduate from high school, and to see if the shock has an effect on their college decision. And so this is the equation that we're going to estimate. So basically, we're going to have individual level data, so we're going to have a linear probability model, very simple. We're not only gonna estimate this, for everyone. We're gonna take into account heterogeneity in wealth, and we're gonna do that by, looking at this kind of spline across the different wealth quartiles. And, we're gonna control by a bunch of things, including parents' education and at the regional level, the income effect of the parents and of the region as well. So this is, I think, one of the nicest features of the paper, which is, we get the positive effect, which is basically in line with our previous estimates. Once you take into account that these are different measures, before we had the college enrolled, 18 to 25 enrolled in college, now we have basically the probability of going to college. But, you would kind of expect this inverted U-turn in the sense that, if you are in one of the poorest households, you just cannot go to college. You cannot afford it. If you're already in the richest households, you were going to go anyway, independently of the shock. So you see most of the action in this, like, in the two middle quartiles. All right. So these facts basically motivate us to propose a model that's going to allow us to talk about these issues. So these are just the main takeaways. So let me jump straight into the model because I'm going to run out of time otherwise. So it's a small open economy with multiple regions, and that's trading goods and assets within and across borders. And in terms of technologies, it's super simple. It's just like an Armington model, right? So each region within the country is going to be producing a particular good that can be traded across regions, but also with the rest of the world. And these intermediates are being traded, and then the final non-tradables are being consumed. Now, in terms of households and workers, this is where the more interesting part comes in. So there are going to be different stages. Workers, so new generations can, decide if they go to college or not. It's going to be a one-time decision at age j equal to 1. The way we're going to model this is by adding this preference shock that it's also relatively common in the literature. Then we're going to have the more usual kind of, local labor market decisions where, ACM and CDP and others have used. So you can always switch at any age between different local labor markets, where local labor market is going to be defined by a sector or region pair. We're also going to have these inter vivos transfers or bequest motives and the idiosyncratic labor risk. So technologies, very usual, CES between skilled and unskilled workers. We're going to assume that we're going to calibrate them all. We're going to assume that there's like the elasticity of substitution across skills is the same across sectors, and nothing too interesting there. Now, one of the things that we're going to assume, which is in line with what some people have shown, is that services is more intensive in college, on average. We know that there's a lot of heterogeneity in services, but on average, services are more intensive in college workers. This is the Armington structure for the whole economy, pretty straightforward. The technology uses these two intermediate goods to produce the final non-tradable good. This is going to be the national regional aggregate. This is going to be the imported good. And this is just an aggregate, Armington aggregate over goods produced in every other region. In every region, and then firms are going to maximize profits, and they're going to be able to import the intermediates subject to these iceberg trade costs. And our focus is going to be, of course, on we're going to shock the iceberg trade cost of imported goods in order to generate the shock that we see in the data. Okay, households. So as I said before, we have this dynastic framework with 3 different stages. Let me start with once you're a worker, the value of a worker of HJ in labor market L, which is, again, a region and an industry pair. They're going to choose consumption and savings to maximize today's utility of consumption and the expected value of moving plus, the continuation value tomorrow. So here we're going to have the usual, Gumbel type of shock that's going to generate these different, the transitions across local labor markets. And here, basically the main departure from ACM, CDP, and other works, including Maurice's work, is that you have access to savings and borrowing, and you have idiosyncratic risk, so this is going to generate an endogenous distribution of wealth. And income is not going to be equal to consumption, so there are going to be these differences. Now, they are also subject to this, idiosyncratic risk, but also incomplete markets and borrowing limits. This is pretty standard in kind of the heterogeneous aging household. And here, notice that education is already fixed. So this is for a given, so this is the level of, you start with the level of assets A, productivity X in local labor market L, and education E, okay? Yeah.
So I can see that you have the savings technology, but that is different from having the realize the follow up technology. I think there are two differences, let's say, with cambiando what you follow. One is like the whole savings technology that you have. They don't have the money. I mean, they pay whatever weights they get, they use.
Uh-huh.
So you have the savings technology, but you also have this timing assumption.
The timing assumption comes with the savings technology in order to simplify things, right? But in,
like when you have one and another, you have like, you receive the epsilon, and then you decide where to live, and at the same time how much to consume, and which assets to have, and you still have a savings technology.
if I get, you mean if I get rid of the CDP kind of thing, or?
No, so here you have two stages with materials. You first decide consumption and savings, and then you observe epsilon.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Why not? Why not have everything simultaneously? Like, why not C and A and choosing after epsilon is realized? Why is it?
Ah, okay. So I mean,
I'm only saying because you're saying
no, I understand now.
it's a key department, so I was trying to understand.
No, I mean, the key departure is the savings technology. Now, in terms of timing, I think this is basically following CDP very closely. It's just that, you know, by assuming that C and A are decided, and A prime are decided before you make the decision to allocate, simplifies a lot, because otherwise you have to take into account when you say how much to save and consume at the same time that you choose where to go to.
But you consume in the place where you want to sell.
Yes, 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 yes. So you see the shock and then you consume and you save there, and then you can take your savings somewhere else. In terms of education, we assume that it takes 2 periods. During those 2 periods, you can still go and look for a job in a different place. Once you decide to study somewhere, then you're basically stuck there. But during that time, we assume that you can work basically half-time, part-time. And there's also an actual cost of acquiring the education, not only the cost of utility cost of going, but also the cost of paying for the education, which is in terms of services, which is also an important feature. And this is, the pre-education stage is where you decide if you go to college or not. So here's where you're going to choose, you're going to maximize if you want to go to college or not, depending on, how costly that is, but also there's going to be a utility shock. There are some people who want to go to college more than others. And the transfers at age J. So just to give you an example, very simple how the policy functions look like. These are the policy functions for education. This is the probability of a college education for a kid, well, basically students with the parents with different levels of productivity. So if you were born in a family with a higher productivity, there's a higher probability that you go to college. You can see that the policy rules or policy functions are not very different, but once you take into account the distribution of wealth, then things look pretty different, right? Because then you have that for families with parents with a high productivity, the distribution is way shifted to the right. So most of the action is happening here, while those in the poorer households, most of the action is happening here. So that's what, in the aggregate, that makes the decision rules very different, the aggregate decision rules. I'm going to breeze through the calibration, because again, we're still working on this, but these are pretty standard parameters in the literature. And the way we're going to do it, the way we're doing it right now, it's very hard to solve them all for more than 3 or 4 regions. So we're going to focus on 3 regions. And we're going to use the data to basically calibrate. The way we're going to do it is we want to construct the instrument, the ADH instrument, in the model. So the way we're going to do it is that we're going to assume the regions are exactly the same, except for relative productivities in manufacturing and services. And that's going to generate heterogeneity in the allocation of labor across these industries, across regions. That's the only thing that we've played with different things. With only changing those, and also changing those and basically the factor intensities. Today I'm going to show you the results where we use both because it gives a nicer fit. And so we basically do it for 3 regions, what we call the West, the Midwest, and the Northeast, where the Midwest is like the high exposed region, the West is the low exposed, and then the Northeast. And then we use data. And again, this is like a very aggregate kind of approach, but it becomes hard to solve them all. And I'm going to assume that during the 1990s, look at trade flows, calibrate trade costs to match the trade flows in 1990s, and then shock the trade cost to generate the increase in trade flows from 1990 to 2010. So the home biases are going to go down from like 98 and 90 to about 75 in, well, manufacturing is more like 70 and services didn't go down as much. Okay. I have like 3 minutes for the dynamics. So cross-regional differences, this is what you would expect. If you know, across different sectors, the wage in services is going to go up, the wage in manufacturing is going to go down. Across different regions, you see that these effects are magnified in the more exposed region. Why? Because that's where most of the action is going on, more reallocation, and things like this. So, and the effects are persistent over time. Now, this is how the wage premium looks like, which is what you would expect. The wage premium goes up. It goes up more in the more exposed region, which we call the Midwest. And that's precisely because of this, expenditure, like expenditure switching effect and all the reallocation that it generates. Now that increase in the college premium generates the increase in the college measure across regions. So this is what's going on in what we call the Northeast, which is the one in the middle. What you can see is there's a large increase in the college measure in the more exposed region, while in the West, you see actually initially a decline. This is the stuff that we're still working on because the size of the shock generates a lot of migration from the West to the Northeast because of the big increase in the North in the wage premium in the Midwest. And that's because we haven't really played much with moving costs at all. That's something that we still need to find a better fit. Now, this is something that we found to be a really nice result, which is we basically look at the model and we see, okay, change in import penetration shock that we generate across regions, and the model generates these 3 dots. And then we just say, okay, we normalize, we take the beta that we get from our estimation, and we just draw the line that's normalized to go through the point in the middle. And this is what we get. So just by generating this heterogeneity across the 3 regions, we actually, in terms of labor allocations, we get a pretty nice fit in terms of the cross-regional.
In the regression, you don't have like this broad linear effects at the country level. But in the model, you do have. So
At the country level, you mean the...
Well, the fact that you have a shock in one region.
Yeah. So that's why, I mean, if I understand correctly your question, that's why we don't have like and we normalize it to go through there, but we could have put that line anywhere. The intercept is what we don't know, right? Who goes more to college? I already showed you the main results, so I have 1 minute left. I'm just going to breeze through the other results. So as you would expect, in the West, the impact on college enrollment across the wealth quartile is pretty flat, and you don't really see an effect. Once you go to the more exposed region, the Midwest, then you see that, this is in line with what the graph I showed you before, which is this inverted U-shape with the PSID data. We get something that looks pretty much or very similar. So this is on impact, right? But now what happens after a generation? So before getting there, let me show you what happens across. This is something I didn't show you in the data, but you can look at this across the different workers in different sectors. Actually, we have been playing with CPS data, and you also get that, the effect in the manufacturing sector is much more in line with this inverted U-shape. But this is something that we're still working on. Now, after a generation, what you see is that it basically, it flattens out, right? Why? Because people adjust, they either move to different sectors, but they also go and acquire an education, and that basically generates a much flatter effect. And so the uneven effects disappear, or not fully disappear, but they dampen after a generation. This is in terms of transfers. I don't want to spend too much time here because just show you that transfers play an important role, and we're looking at this. We can use the PSI data to look at this as well, and that's something that we're doing right now. So in terms of welfare, I'm gonna skip this and focus more on the last point, which is how important is skill acquisition. So it's hard to think about a counterfactual where you actually get rid of skill acquisition in the model. Why? Because how do you impose a rule on the new generations, right? How are they just going to be fixed or not? So we've played around with different things, but in order to do that, we have to simplify them all in other dimensions. So I'm going to show you the results for this island model, where it's just 3 different isolated regions. You know, this is something that you would expect. In the model with endogenous education, there's a larger drop after the large increase in the wage premium. There's afterwards, there's like a large drop in the wage premium as people go more and more to college. That doesn't happen in a fixed education model. Now, in terms of welfare, you can see here that in the fixed education model, on impact, the uneven effects on welfare are pretty much the same. Why? Because going to college is like a slow-moving object. Right? But after a generation, you can see again what I showed you before, which is basically in the fixed education model, this big gap doesn't disappear, while when you have endogenous education, it kind of disappears. So let me conclude, and thank you very much.
So thanks everyone for being here, and thanks to the organizers for including our paper in the program. Today I will talk about trade with nominal rigidities, understanding the unemployment and welfare effects of the China shock. This is joint work with Andres Rodriguez-Clar, who's at UC Berkeley, and Jose Pablo Vazquez, who's at LSE. And there are 6 Costa Ricans in this program, so we're taking over. And all of us, the 3 of us are from Costa Rica. And since I am at the SFED, the usual disclaimer applies. Okay. So in order to motivate this paper, we're going to leverage the by now ubiquitous China shock. We've heard about that already. In the 2013 paper, looking at the effects for the US of the increase in productivity in China between 2000 and 2007, and even before, Otterton and Hanson argued that this exposure in US commuting zones can have important effects, and we have summarized some of these effects in this table. In the red rectangle, you can see that a $1,000 higher per worker exposure in a given commuting zone is associated with a 22 basis points higher unemployment to population ratio, a 55 basis points higher not in the labor force to population ratio, and a 5 basis points fall in population, with the first 2 effects being highly significant. And of course, by now there are a ton of papers looking at this, using empirical methods, quantitative trade models, and other methods. But we still think that we can contribute to better understanding these effects. Because if you look at this shock through the lens of a standard quantitative trade model, for example, the model that Andres has in his handbook chapter with Arnaud Costinot, you get that all of the effects happen through wages because there is inelastic employment and always full employment. And that does not correspond well with the evidence in ADH. Of course, one easy fix would be to add an upward sloping labor supply, and then you can already get employment effects, but there's still 2 problems with doing that. The first one is that you would need labor supply to be extremely elastic in order to match the ADH evidence, and that doesn't correspond well with the macroeconomic evidence on the elasticity of labor supply. And then you still wouldn't have any unemployment, and that could presumably give you different welfare implications than having a model where there's actually unemployment. So what we're going to do in this paper is that we're going to start with a standard quantitative trade model. We're going to add upward sloping labor supply, but we're also going to add nominal frictions in the form of a downward nominal wage rigidity. And this will allow the model to match the participation effects in ADH, but also the unemployment effects in ADH, while having a reasonable elasticity of substitution or labor elasticity, and preserving the exact algebra and tractability of the standard quantitative trade model, and we're also going to be able to do welfare analysis. So let me tell you in a little bit more detail what it is exactly that we do. We're going to start with a multi-sector trade and migration model with an input-output structure in the spirit of Caliendo de Working Amparo, but extended to allow for a difference in the elasticity of moving across sectors, which will be 1 over nu in our model, and the elasticity of moving across regions, which will be 1 over kappa. These 2 are the same in Caliendo de Working Amparo, and having it be different are going to be crucial to match the ADH evidence. We're also going to add downward nominal wage rigidity in a paper by Schmidt, Ghai, and Uribe from 2016 that says that the wage in a given region sector in a given period has to be greater or equal than delta times that same wage in the previous year. Meaning that the wage can fall by no more than 100 times 1 minus delta percent per year. To fix ideas, imagine that delta was 0.98, which is close to what we're going to get in our empirical implementation. That means that the wage can fall at most 2% per year. Then with this model, we're going to do dynamic exact algebra for counterfactual analysis of the China shock starting in year 2001. We're going to put together our data set, combining World Input-Output Database with several other data sets for the US and other countries with migration. And then we're going to do the analysis from 2000 onwards. We're going to calibrate our notion of the China shock, which will be the change in productivity in China between 2000 and 2007 across years and in different sectors in order to match the predicted changes in US imports from China, but also instrumented using other high-income countries as in ADH. And then we're going to pick some of the most important parameters in our model, namely the new inverse elasticity of moving across sectors, the kappa inverse elasticity of moving across regions, and the delta parameter in the downward nominal wage rigidity in order to match the ADH evidence on unemployment, participation, and population that I showed you in the red rectangle, how more or less exposed commuting zones or states, in our case, have different outcomes in these three variables. And then we're going to be able to study the implications of the shock in the model for employment, unemployment, and welfare for the US on aggregate, but also across different states and even dispersion in these measures, which is pretty important. Okay, I'm going to skip the literature and some other things that I would say in a longer presentation and get right to the basic assumptions. Yes.
This is a question, but if we had a real wage rigidity, no, or if we think about, for example, countries with levels of inflation, right? High inflation countries might have much more, real rigidity, or less rigidity. This is kind of a prediction about across the country in the case of the China shock, employment versus wages. It would be interesting to see, and obviously you're from the US case, so that's what it was today. But it'd be interesting to see if you look at the China shock, higher inflation economy than the US, and so whether you see an obvious difference there. Because that would be an implication of this kind of thinking. There would be an obvious way to test it.
Yes, correct. But once you go to different countries, maybe the deltas will be very different. Or the underlying rigidity, the nominal wage rigidity could be different. So even if you have different levels of inflation, then that kind of counteracted. But you're right, and we could try to do something like that, maybe across European countries or something like that. Yeah, we'll think about that more. Okay, so we're going to have a total number of I regions. M of them are going to be inside of the US. That's going to be the 50 US states. Then we're going to have S market sectors plus home production, which will be sector 0 in our case. And we're going to have 14 market sectors, 12 in manufacturing, 1 service sector, 1 aggregate agricultural sector. In consumption, we're going to have Cobb-Douglas preferences in a given region across different market sectors with Cobb-Douglas share alpha IS for region I, sector S, and those are going to be allowed to vary across regions, unlike CDP, in which these are constant across regions in the US, or I think actually all regions in the world. And then within a sector, we're going to have an Armington assumption where the goods of the different origins are aggregated using an elasticity of substitution sigma S, and all income is going to be devoted to consumption. They're going to be hand to mouth, and we're not going to have the savings. In production, there's going to be a Cobb-Douglas production function where certain productivity, then labor with a certain share phi IS, and intermediate input share phi IKS of using the intermediate input of sector K in sector S in region I. And we're going to have perfect competition in production with iceberg trade cost tau IJST of sending from region I to region J in sector S at time T. And with this, we're going to get the usual things where the aggregate price index in region I at time T is the multiplication of all the sectorial price indices raised to the power of the Cobb-Douglas shares. The sectoral price index itself is the usual CES aggregation of the different goods of the different origins. And then the price of sending from I to J in sector K at time T includes the iceberg trade cost, the productivity of the sender country dividing, and the wages and sectoral price indices of the sender region with their respective shares. That's pretty standard stuff. We're also going to allow for exogenous trade imbalances as usual in the trade literature, so that the amount spent of consumption is income plus this transfer from the rest of the world. In our baseline specification, these transfers are going to be kept fixed as a share of world GDP in dollars, but in one of our extensions, we allow the transfers to change with the China shock, so that China is saving more and the US has a higher transfer. In one of our extensions. Then we're going to have that equilibrium in sector S in region I at time t says that revenue in that region sector has to be equal to total demand, and demand comes from all countries that can demand your good with certain trade shares, and then demand comes from two parts, final demand, which depends on the Cobb-Douglas shares, and intermediate input use that depends on the intermediate input shares. And then we're going to have labor market clearing in region I, sector K at time t, saying that total labor compensation, W times L, has to equal the revenue in that region sector times the labor share. And then in the standard trade model, we would close this model by saying that there is free mobility within sectors in a region, no mobility across regions, and exogenous labor, so that the total amount of employment in that region sector, in that region across all sectors has to equal the exogenous labor supply. But here we will have a more complicated labor supply, which will share several elements with Caliendo working Amparo. So we will have agents that can move across sectors and regions within the US, only across sectors in other countries, because we don't have regions in other countries, and there's no movement across countries, as is usual in these models. We're going to have forward-looking agents with perfect foresight that can move subject to reallocation costs. And in region I at time t, home production is going to yield a real compensation of mu I that will not vary across time, and participation in sector S is going to yield a real compensation of omega IST, and I will come back to what this is later. But differently from CDP, as I mentioned before, we're going to have a nested gumbo for the amenity shock of participating in these region sectors, so that we can separate the elasticity of moving across sectors, which is this 1 over nu, and the elasticity of moving across regions, which is this 1 over kappa. Coming back to this real compensation of participating in a given region sector, in Caliendo working Amparo, that would simply be given by the real wage. But with the downward nominal wage rigidity, we have the possibility of unemployment. So we have to adjust for that. So that real compensation is going to be the real wage, but adjusted for the probability that you're employed in that region sector, which is the total amount of employed people dividing by the total labor supply to that region, which is this cursive LIST. And here we're assuming that there is some income sharing for the people in that region sector, so that they all obtain this like kind of average instead of the unemployed ones obtaining 0 and the employed ones obtaining the full real wage. This is done for tractability, and it indicates that in a more granular analysis, perhaps the losses from this China shock or this unemployment would be greater. But we can solve this model this way. And this block is going to determine the endogenous labor supply, this cursive LIST. Yeah, you choose a sector and a region, and then you participate in that labor market, and you can be unemployed. But here, everyone is just going to receive this given the unemployment level. But yeah. And you have perfect foresight, so you know in some sense what the unemployment is going to be when you go into that sector, and you take that into consideration. So sectors that are going to be affected a lot by the China shock, people are going to be reticent to move into that sector because they know that there's going to be a period of unemployment. When they learn about the China shock, which will be in 2001, I'll tell you a bit more about that later. Okay, so now I'll tell you more about the downward nominal wage rigidity. As I said, that indicates that the wage in region I, sector S at time t, has to be greater or equal than that same wage in the previous year times this delta parameter. And there are two important things here to mention. The first one is that this delta parameter could in principle vary across regions, sectors, and even time. In our quantitative implementation, in order to be able to do something realistic here, we're going to have it be the same across regions and time. And in our baseline specification, it's also going to be the same across sectors. In one of our extensions, we're going to allow it to vary across sectors. So that's why we have a delta S here, different between manufacturing and non-manufacturing. The second important thing here is that this is a nominal constraint. So it's given in terms of the local currency units of the region I that we care about. For the 50 US states, that's obviously going to be the dollar, but for other countries, it's going to be their own local currency unit. And then we're going to need to translate that using some exchange rate, and I'm going to come back to that later. So besides this downward nominal wage rigidity, we have the maximum employment constraint saying that total employment in that region sector time has to be smaller or equal to labor supply, and then a complementary slackness saying that one of these two inequalities at least has to hold with equality. So let me come back to this thing about the local currency units. Up to now, we have been expressing everything that's a nominal variable in terms of US dollars. So I want to change these local currency units to US dollars, so we use this exchange rate. We can write it this way, and then we have this ratio of the exchange rate across different time, and we can assume different things for this for the third countries that are neither the US nor China. In our baseline specification, we're going to assume that they have exchange rate flexibility so that they can manipulate this ratio in order to never have unemployment, so that this downward nominal wage rigidity is never going to bind. But in one of our extensions, we're going to assume that they have fixed exchange rate to the US so that this ratio is equal to 1, and then the downward nominal wage rigidity takes the same form in other countries as it does in the US. And in some sense, this change in this ratio gives us variation in this delta across regions as well, but not for the ones that are in the US. For the US, we're assuming that this delta is the same across regions. We could have it vary depending on, there are estimates of these deltas for different states, so we could try to use that, and we might go there in the next iteration of the paper. Okay, and one more thing, since we impose this nominal constraint, now, namely the downward nominal wage rigidity, we also need to assume a nominal anchor. That is something that prevents wages in all regions in the world from increasing fast enough in order to have the downward nominal wage rigidity never bind. And what we'll do in this paper is assume that world nominal GDP in US dollars grows at a rate of gamma. This is, of course, a simplification. You could have something more complicated saying that each country has its own Taylor rule or something like that. We use this because it has several benefits for us. The first is that it allows us to solve our otherwise unwieldy trade and migration model using a fast contraction mapping algorithm in the spirit of Alvarez and Lucas that we developed in order to deal precisely with these constraints imposed by the downward nominal wage rigidity, these three conditions. With anything else, it would be extremely slow to solve this model. The second one is that for a gamma equal to 1, this captures a kind of stock level of global aggregate demand as would be given by a global savings glut or a liquidity trap, perhaps. And it can also capture something like the effects of China not wanting its currency to appreciate or to have a lot of internal inflation, which was indeed happening between 2000 and 2007. If we only had something like this, but for the US or for the different countries, but independently, then we wouldn't be able to capture that. And that's a big part of what's going on. Okay, so given the time, I'm going to tell you pretty fast about some of the other steps that we do. We're going to assume that agents did not expect the China shock up until 2000. Then in 2001, they learned that the China shock is going to hit, including the path going forward from 2001 to 2007 of the China shock with perfect foresight. And then we solved the model using dynamic exacted algebra as inito and quartum and extended to dynamic settings by CDP. We're going to construct a data set, as I said, with 87 regions, 50 US states, 36 other countries, and aggregate rest of the world region, and 15 sectors, including home production, using the World Input-Output Database, commodity flow survey for the US, census data, BEA data, and then data for migration within the US coming from the ACS and the CPS, and other stuff. But I'm going to skip that in the interest of time. We're going to construct the ADH version of exposure to China, but at the state level. And then we're going to calibrate the changes in Chinese productivity in order to match the predicted change in imports from China to the US using like the same 8 high-income countries as an instrument. But again, this is going to happen year by year and across the different sectors in order to match the changes in imports. We're going to assume a trade elasticity of 5 in all sectors. I was happy when I saw the estimates because they're kind of similar. But this is at the yearly level. So I would expect like I was thinking that like that would be important, and quarterly it could be like smaller, but we have yearly anyway, and I think this is okay. And then the gamma parameter in the growth rate of world nominal GDP in dollars, we're going to set it to 1 without loss of generality, because what matters here is the difference between the gamma and the delta. For a given delta, if gamma is high enough, there will never be any unemployment. For a given gamma, if delta is low enough, there will never be any unemployment. So we set gamma to 1, and we put the burden of adjustment on delta, which is something similar to what's done by Schmidt-Grohe and Uribe. And then we're going to match the ADH evidence on unemployment, participation, and population that I showed you on the red rectangle, which is here, like the 22 basis points higher unemployment to population ratio, etc. And what we obtain is that the delta is very close to 0.98, so that these wages can fall 2% per year. The new inverse elasticity of moving across sectors is 0.55, and the kappa inverse elasticity of moving across regions is 12. So two things to note here. First, there is a higher elasticity of move, because this is inverse, so there's a higher elasticity of moving across sectors than of moving across regions, and they're pretty different, and that's important to match the ADH evidence. If we had them equal, as in CDP, we would obtain too little movement not in the labor force compared to ADH, and way too high population effect. So people would be moving across states super easily. Yes, yes. And in theory here, we're using that to calibrate both how easy it is to move between home production and the market, and also between different sectors of the market. We could also have like another nest here, but it would be more complicated. Some intuition for what's going on. Here we have labor in the x-axis and the nominal wage in the y-axis, and labor supply and labor demand. The China shock would be given by a fall in labor demand because there's more competition from China, but since what we have in this axis is a nominal wage, we also need to move the labor supply to the right because prices are falling. So we end up with a lower nominal wage, but even lower prices, so that the real wage increases and the total labor employed and supplied increases. But this is with flexibility. With the downward nominal wage rigidity, the wage can only fall a given amount on the first year. Labor supply doesn't adjust all the way because prices and wages have not fallen all the way. So we can have unemployment between L1 and A in the first year. Then the wage can fall further as given by the downward nominal wage rigidity in the second year. We have unemployment between L2 and B. And then by the third year, in this simple example, we adjust to the same level that we would have had in the case with flexibility. But after we went through a period where there was unemployment that opened up and then closed, and labor supply went down and then eventually increased to the level that it was going to increase in the case with flexibility. And this is something similar to what we see here in our actual quantitative implementation for the US as a whole. This is aggregate unemployment. We see that it picks up in 2003 and 2004. Then there's a lull, then picks up a little bit more by 2007, and then eventually disappears. And there are 3 reasons why there are dynamics in this graph. The first one is that the China shock hits year by year and in different sectors, as I explained. It hits the hardest in 2004-5, but then again in 2007, then it eventually disappears. The second reason is that the downward nominal wage rigidity allows for 2% of the wage falling in each year, so that if there was like a big shock only in 2004, the wage could fall a little bit 2004, then 2005, then 2006, then eventually all the unemployment would go away. But it would take different amount of time to go away in all the different sectors and regions, depending on how exposed they are to China. And the third one is the CDP dynamics, where people are moving across regions and sectors, and they have perfect foresight, and all of that is going on. And this is some of our results across states. We have that only one of the 50 US states actually suffers a fall in its terms of trade in the new steady state. And it also suffers a fall in welfare and a fall in labor in the transition. But there are 7 additional states that, even though they have higher terms of trade in the new steady state, due to the transition period where they can suffer unemployment and a fall in employment, they can actually turn the welfare gain that they would have had in the new steady state if there was flexibility to a welfare loss due to this downward nominal wage rigidity and the transition. And they also suffer loss in transition. 23 additional states, even though they have higher terms of trade in steady state and even positive welfare, they still have some unemployment and some fall in employment in the transition. And these 19 states that have higher everything. Thanks. And here we have some of the results in our baseline and the extensions. Let me tell you what's going on here. Here we have how additional exposure to China using this ADH-like exposure, but at the state level, affects different quantities, like unemployment, not in the labor force, population, but also manufacturing and non-manufacturing wage, and manufacturing and non-manufacturing employment. And this column for ADH is the same thing that I showed you in the very first slide. And we see the 22 basis points, the 55 basis points, and the 5 basis points fall. And this column 2 is our baseline. And we see that we're targeting unemployment, so we get the same. We're targeting not in the labor force, we get the same. We're targeting population, we get the same. But this distribution between manufacturing and non-manufacturing employment and manufacturing and non-manufacturing wage, we're not targeting. We do like okay, but we get the smaller fall in manufacturing employment than in ADH and a bigger fall in non-manufacturing employment than in ADH. And in wages, we do pretty well. The manufacturing wage is close to 0, and the non-manufacturing wage is higher. And then we see how also higher exposure affects welfare in the case with the downward nominal wage rigidity and in the case without it. No, sorry, this is the mean welfare change. This is not how it varies with exposure to China. This is just the mean for the US. In the paper, we also have how it changes with exposure to China. And we have some of our extensions here. This is no migration, so that there is no migration across different states in the US, but also definitely movement across sectors within a region. So here we have that the population response is 0 because we're not allowing migration. These are our initial parameters. Now we don't have a parameter for the movement across states, and our parameter for the movement across sectors doesn't change much. And that is because the original movement across states anyway was kind of small, so that we don't affect things very much here. We're still targeting these two things, and this thing we're no longer targeting, but this doesn't change much relative to our baseline. But that is to say, basically, if we didn't have migration, it wouldn't be a big deal. But referees like to see that, and they ask for this. And that's there. Exactly, yes. So to still match these two things by using this and this parameter. Before we had 3 parameters, we were matching 3 things. Now we have 2 parameters, we're matching these 2 things, no longer matching this thing. The change in productivity in China also changes, yeah. And then this is the column where we put the downward nominal wage rigidity only in manufacturing. And this is interesting because this model matches the non-targeted moments a lot better. Now there's a big change in manufacturing employment, smaller change in non-manufacturing employment, similar to ADH, and the change in manufacturing employment becomes positive, but it's not significant, but very close to the one in ADH, and a higher change in non-manufacturing employment. And we think that this is capturing for something like maybe even before the China shock hits, there was a stagnation in the wages in non-manufacturing, higher growth in the wages in services, and then when the shock hits, that is why the model kind of likes that there's downward nominal wage rigidity only in manufacturing. And the difference in the welfare change between the case with no downward nominal wage rigidity and with downward nominal wage rigidity is around 1/3. So the US as a whole would lose 1/3 of the welfare gains from this transition period where there's unemployment and fall in employment as well. Okay, so let me just conclude. We've argued that the downward nominal wage rigidity and upward sloping labor supply in a standard quantitative trade model can explain the increase in unemployment and even larger increase in not in the labor force that we observe in ADH while having realistic parameter values like a realistic labor supply elasticity. This model leads to realistic dispersion in the employment and income effects across US states, which is something that has been emphasized by the ADH 2021 paper as well as the Adauer, Kolakis, and Esposito paper. We basically nail the dispersions that those 2 papers are finding in employment and income effects with our quantitative trade model just by having this downward nominal wage rigidity and these 2 different elasticities of moving across regions and sectors. And each of those gives us kind of half of the dispersion compared to something like CDP or the slicing the pie paper, which those 2 papers get the dispersion pretty wrong according to the AAE paper. It also rationalizes the importance of ADA's exposure, because if you have like a neoclassical trade model, the exposure that would matter would be a net export exposure, where you're capturing both consumption and export exposure. But once we have the downward nominal wage rigidity, we can see why exactly it is that the ADH exposure becomes relevant. And there's more on that in the paper. And this has relevant implications for welfare. Again, the US loses like 33% of its welfare gains, and we can also see how different states are affected. Some caveats, we have somewhat mechanical macro rules, like that constant growth rate of the world nominal GDP in dollars, and also the risk sharing within a region sector, but those could be relaxed later on. It's a bit tricky, but we can think about that.